Veni Domine Maranatha, sito veni Maranatha.
I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker. I had no idea that John lived in the area. Actually, I got a hold of his book. And then I think I mentioned last month, I was startled to see that the imprimatur was written by our own bishop. And I went, where is this guy even from? And then I find out he's right down the road. And without even knowing me or him, and sort of a phantom email, he was quick to respond and quick to generously accept the offer to come here and speak tonight. So I'm really grateful to that, John. Really grateful. Before I introduce him, there are some of his books available in the back. I know many of you have read it. I've read it. It's phenomenal. It is an excellent, excellent book. And those are on sale. So if you would like one, please buy them up tonight. I'd be really grateful if you did. All right. John Bursch is the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy for Alliance Defending Freedom, the world's largest public interest law firm defending religious liberty, free speech, and the right to life. He's argued 12 U.S. Supreme Court cases, that's a few more than Joe Scoville, 36 state Supreme Court cases, and hundreds of others in courts around the country involving the most pressing social issues of the day. The title of his lecture tonight is Loving God's Children, the Church and Gender Ideology. Let's give Mr. Bursch a nice, warm welcome.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. Delight to be here. Just a couple of little notes before I get started. First, when I was a very young lawyer at Warner Norcross and Judd, I wanted to be Judge Scoville and modeled my writing and my advocacy after him. Yeah. Second, for those of you who don't have students who just graduated from Sacred Heart, I had the honor of being the commencement speaker here at the school at the end of this past school year. And I got these lovely cufflinks from Father Ron, and I am wearing these tonight. And related to that, I was wearing these same cufflinks in court in Cincinnati because, as you know, Alliance Defending Freedom has the Sacred Heart Schools lawsuit against the state of Michigan. And we got some really good news from the Sixth Circuit on that recently. The case, just in a nutshell, involves the Michigan expansion of its public accommodation laws to protect gender identity and sexual orientation. And there is no religious exemption. It is the only statute like that anywhere in the United States, although Washington's operates like that as well now because of a judicial decision. And that's significant because at Sacred Heart, that means if a boy wants to be in the girls' showers or compete on the girls' sports teams, under Michigan law, the school is supposed to allow that. Or if someone came to the school to apply to be a teacher or even the principal, even if that meant they were a religious catechist, they would have a strong argument that they could be in a same-sex marriage or identify as transgender, and the school would have to hire them, or otherwise they'd be in violation of state law. And so we filed a lawsuit on behalf of the school to protect its ability to practice the Catholic faith in everything that it does. And a judge here in Grand Rapids, a federal judge, threw it out without allowing us even the opportunity to have an oral argument in court, just on the papers. And basically what she said is that there was no threat that the state of Michigan, specifically Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, would enforce that law against a religious school, which is kind of laughable because Dana Nessel has a history of persecuting members of the church. You might remember her comment about not trusting someone at the door with a rosary, only look for a badge. And so we went to the Sixth Circuit, and the draw that we had there was not ideal. One of the judges was the one who wrote the Sixth Circuit's decision that the trial judge relied on in reaching that result, and then another colleague who shared a lot of her judicial philosophies. And despite that, that panel, panel that you would have expected to rule against the school, reinstated the case in full and sent it back. And so that's a huge victory, and I want to thank you all for your support and your prayers. So last housekeeping thing, I'm so pleased that Father Ron started with the St. Michael prayer. I was going to do that myself. Just got back literally last night with my wife. We celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary and our empty nest trip after the 5th child went off to her Catholic college. And one of the places that we visited was Mont Saint-Michel in northwest France. And if you haven't ever seen a picture, it's the most extraordinary thing you've ever seen. It's this enormous Catholic abbey, originally constructed in the 1100s, built on a rock on this island where the water comes in and goes out. And at the peak of this abbey is a statue of St. Michael on top, kind of showing not only France, but the world that God is still in control. And that's an important thing to remember when we're talking about gender ideology, because sometimes it feels like we're losing control and maybe even God has lost control of the culture. But we know that's not the case. So I'm pleased to be here to talk about what can be a really difficult topic. And it's one that's impacting almost everybody. I was in Ann Arbor last fall talking about this at a Catholic high school, about 200 people there, and I asked how many individuals there had a family member or close friend who was impacted in some way by gender ideology. And about a third of the people raised their hand. Right here in Rockford, Alliance Defending Freedom has a lawsuit on behalf of some parents whose daughter was transitioned to become a boy at school while keeping it a secret from the parents, if you can imagine that, in violation of any basic notion of parental rights. And I should clarify, too, that although I work at Alliance Defending Freedom and litigate these issues all the time, I'm not actually here tonight in my capacity as an ADF lawyer, but just as a dad of 5 kids and a Catholic who cares deeply about these issues and has spent a lot of time thinking about them. So before we dive into kind of the nuts and bolts of gender ideology. And we're going to do this at a high level because I hope to finish in just under an hour and give you an opportunity for questions. There are 3 subject areas I want to cover briefly that kind of set the foundation for this subject. And those are love, truth, and the church's views of the body versus culture's views of the body. And those will kind of set the foundation for everything else that we talk about. So first, what is love? I'm confident that Father Ron has talked to this community frequently about that. Love is not the mushy, sentimental feeling that you see in the movies and on television and things like that. But the Catechism of the Church teaches us that to love is to will the good of another. And so that has 3 components. First, love is not a feeling, it's an action, an intentional action. Second, love always focuses on someone else. It's not about how I'm feeling, it's about how I'm acting for someone else's benefit. And the third, it does not always result in that other person's happiness, but in their good, which is something completely different. A simple example that all the parents in the room will understand. You have a child. They desperately want to touch a hot stove. They say, it's going to make me happy if I do that. And you don't allow them to do that. Why? Well, first, you know something they don't, that if they touch a hot stove, they're going to be burned. But second, it's because you love them. So you don't give them what they want, the thing they desire, the thing that they think will make them happy. Instead, you take the action that will result in their good. That is the Catholic understanding of love. And when we act in love, but we do it without truth, that's the second topic, love can become cruel. So think about someone who has anorexia. Let's say that we think that what's in their best interest is to pursue that dysphoria that they have in their head about their body, that they should eat less, maybe even have a surgery. We would never encourage someone to do something like that because there's a truth about the body when someone has anorexia, which is that their reality in their mind is not the reality of their body. Their body needs more nourishment. And if they starve themselves, if they have surgery to reduce their food intake, ultimately that's going to hurt them. And so it's important that when we act in love, that we also act in truth. And that's a problem in today's society because our culture is dominated by this notion of moral relativism. That's what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. And really our disagreements are not even philosophical differences, but they don't matter at all. And so the great questions in life, what is my identity? Why do I exist? Is there a God who created me and loves me? What's my purpose? Those kinds of things, they don't have any meaning, because if truth is subjective, it's like talking about your favorite type of chocolate chip cookie, or favorite type of cookie. It's chocolate chip versus something else. But people like moral relativism because it seems non-judgmental. If I strongly believe that life begins at conception, I don't have to confront my neighbor who's getting an abortion because that might not be true for them. But if you think about it, it's actually a depressing philosophy, because if there is no objective truth, something that can be discerned with reason and intellect, then nothing that we do matters. And it doesn't make any sense because it doesn't let us off the hook from our bad consequences. And so that's why the church teaches that God's truth, which is objective, can be discerned, it's true for all people, all times, all places, is what we're constantly searching for. That's part of what we pursue as members of the Catholic Church. And yet, 90% plus of our young people, looking now at high school, college, and recent college graduates, subscribe to moral relativism. And it makes it difficult to talk about things like what is the meaning or purpose of the human body, and is gender ideology something that we should go along with or something that we should oppose, unless we can all agree that there's a truth about the human body and sexuality that can be discerned and taught to others. So then kind of the third pillar are the differing views of the church and culture when it comes to the human body. And of course, the church has this great teaching from St. Pope John Paul II, the theology of the body. And what he explains through this series of 129 weekly addresses in papal audiences, that we can better understand God's nature from the design of our bodies. Well, why is that? Well, everything in the universe, every star, every tree, every body, proclaims some truth about its maker. If I'm looking at this lectern, or if I'm looking at this pocket watch and I closely examine it, looking at how it was designed and how it was put together will tell me something about the person who designed it and put it together. And the body is the same way. And so what John Paul II explains, going all the way back to Genesis, that in the beginning God creates everything and it's good. Creation of man is very good, until you get to chapter 2, and then he sees that God is alone, and he says that is not good. It's the first time that the design is not good. And so the problem is man needs a partner, an ezer in Hebrew, E-Z-E-R. And we often translate that as a helpmate. And I think that's a barrier to our understanding of the relationship of men to women, because an ezer is not just someone who will go get your coffee, not a gopher. An ezer is someone who is critical, indispensable to who you are and your success as a person. God is referenced as an ezer in the Old Testament 16 times. So this isn't someone who's merely getting the coffee. This is someone who is indispensable to your good. And Adam has all the animals, he has the birds, he has the sea creatures, but none of them is a suitable helpmate. And so that's when God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And that's the first time that we get something out of this creation narrative about God, other than that he can create things out of nothing. We understand that God is a community of persons. Much later, we find out that it's a Trinity. And it's from that external exchange of love between God the Father and God the Son that precedes God the Holy Spirit. And because we're made in that same image and likeness, our purpose as humans is also to be in relationship, to exchange love. The kind of love we were talking about just a few moments ago, where we're always willing the good of the other. The animals can't do that, the birds can't do that, the sea creatures can't do that, but Eve was created so that man could have that relationship. And so Adam immediately says, when he sees her, and remember, this is without any clothing, this is at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman. So he's immediately drawn to her physical body, and he understands intuitively a couple things. First, that she's different than the animals. She's like him. They share something in common. But he also recognizes that there are differences. They're both standing there naked. And that complementariness is an important part of the relationship that they're going to have. Because every single one of us has a respiratory system and a circulatory system and a muscular system that works just fine on its own. But our reproductive system is only half of the equation. A man and a woman on their own cannot create new life. They need to come together. A conjugal relationship. And sometimes you'll hear objections to the Catholic view of marriage because it was only addressed in the Old Testament and Jesus never talked about that, but that's totally false. Because Jesus in Matthew and Mark and St. Paul in Ephesians makes this reference to God's statement in Genesis that a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's why a man and a woman in a sacramental marriage become one body. They give everything to each other, even their reproductive capacity. They don't hold anything back. That's why the Catholic Church teaches that contraception is morally wrong, because that's saying, I give you everything and every part of me except for my reproductive capacity. I'm going to keep that for myself. I'm going to be selfish about that. No, we don't do that. It's violating the nature of sex to do that. And instead, we give everything in the same way that God the Father and God the Son love each other unconditionally. They don't hold anything back. And so now, putting this all together, we can see something about how the body teaches us about God's nature. That exchange of love between Father and Son, proceeding from which is the Holy Spirit. In the same way, when a man and a woman love themselves or love each other unconditionally and come together in a conjugal relationship, proceeding from them can be a third person that needs its own name, a son or a daughter. And so Christopher West talks about this beautifully, that the family is an icon of the Trinity. The human sexual capacity and relationship tells us something about the Trinitarian nature of God. So you contrast that then with the cultural view of the body. And I don't think we have any kids here who are like older than 2 and younger than 14, do we? Okay, so then I'll talk explicitly about some of these things. Culture teaches that there's this false freedom about the body, that you can do anything you want with it, that diminishes marriage and children and families. So the church teaches that our freedom is to do what we ought. Culture teaches that freedom is to do what we want. The church teaches that sex should only take place in the confines of a sacramental marriage. Culture teaches that you can have sex anytime, anywhere, with anyone, with absolutely no restrictions. Church teaches no contraception. The culture teaches us contraception is necessary to avoid the consequences of having sex. The church teaches that abortion, the taking of an innocent human life, is always wrong in all circumstances. The culture teaches that abortion is a perfectly reasonable backup plan when contraception fails, which it inevitably will. People don't understand that abortion rates actually go up when contraception is introduced into third world countries, because those people who are using the contraception have already made the decision they want to have sex without its consequences. And so then when they get pregnant, the only thing that they can turn to is abortion. The church teaches that marriage is exclusive, that it's permanent, that it should be fruitful. Culture teaches the exact opposite. It doesn't have to be permanent. It doesn't have to be exclusive. It doesn't have to be fruitful. You can have a same-sex marriage. The church teaches that we shouldn't be looking at pornography because that treats someone as an object, and that's not loving them. That's just self-gratification. Society teaches us that pornography is one of the greatest things that you can look at on the internet. There's a free speech case at the U.S. Supreme Court coming up this year with age restrictions, and the ACLU is representing the porn business. Because they think that unnecessarily restricts speech to have an age limit that some people may not be able to access their porn because they're afraid to hand over information about their age. Even things like self-stimulation, that the culture says, yeah, that's a fine way to satisfy yourself sexually. Well, that's the most selfish thing that you can do. It teaches young boys and young girls that you don't have to sacrifice, that you don't have to compromise, that you don't have to do any of the things that are necessary to have a meaningful relationship. And so all of this is about selfishness instead of care and love. And what are the consequences of all these cultural lessons that we're teaching our young people? 63 million lives lost to abortion since Roe and counting. A divorce rate that's been over, or at least hovering around 50% since no-fault divorce was introduced in the 1970s. A lower marriage rate than at any time in the history of the world. fewer children being brought into the world. Those who are born are more often born out of wedlock than any time in our history. We have sexual assaults, objectification of women, harassment, low feelings of self-worth, higher suicide rates, especially among young people, more depression, especially among young people. And all of these things are the natural consequences of following the culture's ideas about sex in the human body. And that's because those are sinful. God gives us a plan for human flourishing. That human flourishing can only happen when we follow God's plan. And when we depart from it, bad things happen. Quick note about that when you're talking to young people about this. Sometimes they think the church is always about, no, you can't have same-sex marriage, you can't have pornography, you can't have masturbation, you can't have contraception. The church is always saying no to all these sexual things. But that's not true at all. The church's teachings about the human body and about sex are just like the car manual that you get when you buy a car. It used to come in the glove box, maybe now you look at it on your phone or on the internet. A car manual is not a list of no's telling you things that you can't do because someone wants to oppress you or because they're going to punish you if you don't follow those rules. No, that book was created by the designers, the manufacturers of the car, to make sure that it works to its optimal capacity. And you don't have to change the oil or the oil filter, and you don't have to change the tires. It's completely up to you. You've got the freedom to do that. But when you depart from that plan, the car will start to break down, and eventually it will cease to work. And human beings are exactly the same way. When we don't follow God's manual for how we should treat the body and human sexuality, we get all of these terrible consequences. So, all of that background now brings us to the main subject of the talk tonight, which is gender ideology. So the foundational idea of theology of the body is that we're not just disembodied souls trapped in a shell of a body. That was a 2nd century heresy, Gnosticism, that came about because people were having a hard time believing that Jesus rose soul and body. They could believe that his soul rose from the dead. I mean, that was a Jewish concept that people at least had in their mind. But the idea that his body could rise from the dead, that was too much. And so there was this idea that you could separate the soul from the mind. And the church stamped it out then and several other times over the last 2,000 years. And yet, here we are again. We are embodied souls. We are inextricably linked to our bodies. John Paul II says, the body expresses the person. And again, we all intuitively understand this. If I would slap you, you would say, you slapped me. You wouldn't say, you slapped my body. Because we identify ourselves, our persons, with the body. And we know the Nicene Creed that we say at Mass every Sunday, that our bodies and our souls will be united together in heaven someday. That's the grand design. So that this modern gender ideology ideal is just recycling this Gnostic heresy. We believe our bodies are good because God created them. We don't want to escape them. We don't want to change them in a way that's inconsistent with his plan. So what's this gender identity? Well, it's defined as someone who identifies as a gender that's different than their sex. And there's a wide variety of gender identities. Sometimes we only think that it's a male who identifies as female or vice versa. But on Facebook, they started expanding the different gender identities that you could check your box in. And when they got to 74 or 76, they finally just gave up and said, well, you can just write your own on a line, and we're not going to put anybody in a box. You can define for yourself who you are. So your gender identity could be non-binary, it could be transitional, it could be genderqueer, it could be two-spirit, which is kind of a Native American gender identity concept. All these different things. And I was having a conversation with someone just before we began, and his question was, well, where did all this come from? The notion that our gender was different than our sex, because historically we all kind of thought those were the same things. Well, it starts with a psychologist, and ironically his name was John Money. And I say ironically because of all the money in the industry of so-called gender care today, and I'll come back to that. But back in the 1950s, he was experimenting with this idea that there was a gender that was distinct from someone's sex. This was 1950s version of Gnosticism. And the key experiment that he had involved a pair of identical twin boys. And one of them had a botched circumcision. And so his sexual organs were irreparably damaged. They could not be repaired. And the parents didn't know what to do, and so they went to Mr. Money and said, how are we going to raise this child of ours? And he said, well, you should raise him as a girl. And then over the ensuing years, he conducted experiments on the two of them. So now you've got boy being raised as a girl, boy being raised as a boy, identical genes. So now he has a test where he can see whether his thesis is correct, that there's a gender that's different than sex. And at the end of all that, he concludes that yes, there is, and that launches the whole modern gender psychology and medical movement. Well, it turns out that while all that was taking place, he was forcing those twin boys to engage in sexual acts and other things. All kinds of abuse was taking place. And the boy who was raised as a girl had all kinds of emotional and psychological problems from that, and eventually committed suicide. So there was nothing about that experiment that suggested that raising him as a girl was successful. That it was possible to take a boy and turn him into a girl with no consequences. But everybody likes to just ignore that, and now today we have gender which is separate from sex. The church, of course, teaching that human nature is composed of this unity of body and soul, means that sex is biological and it's immutable reality. This is one of these truths that we live with and that we can't change. And it's determined at conception. Whereas someone who promotes gender ideology will say someone's sex is assigned at birth based on these external signs like their genitalia, but that their gender is something that's discovered later. And the thing to keep in mind is that even though men and women are biologically different and different in many other ways too, that doesn't mean that there isn't a spectrum of ways that people express their sexuality. So there might be guys who like to cook and engage in domestic stuff. That doesn't mean that they're girls. Even though stereotypically you think only women like to cook, right? Well, none of us believe that's true. In the old days, if there was a girl who liked to engage in sports and climb trees, she was called a tomboy. Today, she's just called a boy. And her parents are told that she has to be given puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery so that she actually is a boy. But if you actually drew like a bell curve of how males behave and how females behave, there's a huge overlap in the middle. And the fact that we express ourselves, live in different ways, doesn't mean that we're not that sex anymore. And some of these stereotypes about what is traditionally male or female are true cultural stereotypes that change over time. So today, if I asked you, what's the color for boys and girls at the hospital? Everybody would say blue and pink, right? But if you go back to the early 1900s, pink was considered the color for boys because it was considered a stronger color. Isn't that funny? So the fact today that a boy likes pink clothes doesn't mean that he's a girl any more than it did when parents put their boys in pink clothes back in the 1910s and the 1920s. It also doesn't change the fact that every cell in our body is coded with our DNA that says whether we're a boy or a girl, and that our bodies will develop in a certain way that tells scientists whether we're a boy or a girl. If someone identifies as the opposite sex or as non-binary or genderqueer, when they die at the end of their lives and there's an examination of their body, I can tell you that there will be no question about whether they were a boy or a girl based on their body. So how do we get to a place where today 10% of our young people identify as transgender? In some states, it's even higher than that. And it mostly comes about because we're still back in the garden and we're still trying to eat the apple or the fig, depending on your interpretation of the tree. We've got people today who make the same choice as Adam and Eve. I don't trust God's plan. I'm going to take things into my own hands because I know what's best for my flourishing. And so when someone identifies as transgender, that's rejecting the gift of the sexuality that God gave to them, and instead saying, I know better than God what my sex or gender should be, and I'm going to manipulate my body in a way so that I can present to the world consistent with what I think. And of course, when we do that, we reject our ability to be icons of the Trinity, because we're going to lose our sexual capacity and our reproductive capacity. And we're also relying on very gross stereotypes about what it feels like to be male or female. And maybe you've seen pictures sometimes, of men who identify as women, and they have absolutely enormous chests. And they dress in ridiculously inappropriate clothes. Well, that doesn't reflect the picture of what a real woman is, but it's their own stereotype of what they think women look like. So we're going to get into the science on this in a moment. But there's three philosophies that underlie this transgender movement that I want to touch on quickly that kind of bring together everything that we've been talking about so far. First, that feelings identify our identity more than anything else. There is no objective reality, there is only feeling. Second, human integrity means acting on my plan rather than God's plan, taking the apple or taking the fig. And third, anyone who doesn't affirm this mistaken philosophy, which, as we'll talk about, hurts and wounds people, just like when you don't follow the manual, hates trans people. Quick anecdote on that. When the Vatican, through what was then known as the Congregation on Education, issued kind of the church's first document, there's been many now, explaining to Catholic schools that boys can only be boys and girls can only be girls, and did it in the nicest possible way, saying, everybody needs to be treated with respect and dignity, no one can be discriminated against, but here are some basic ground rules that Catholic schools have to follow. The New York Times immediately editorialized about what a hateful statement this was. So you're either on board with the agenda or you hate people, which is absolutely ridiculous, and it shuts down the very conversations we need to have about what's true. So Pope Francis has since spoken about this himself. CDF has spoken about this. We have all kinds of great documents from Catholic bishops. I summarize a number of these in the books. But they all talk about the Catholic Church's understanding of human sexuality in ways that are consistent with what we've been talking about. And Pope Francis actually adds something that I think is really helpful to the dialogue. He says that when we reject the gift of our bodies, it ends up violating the two great commandments, to love God and to love other people. Well, first, how does it mean rejecting God? Well, if we're rejecting the gift, then we're not loving God unconditionally. I mean, that's kind of an easy one to figure out. But how about loving our neighbor? And Pope Francis makes the point that when we can't accept our authentic identity as male or female in the body that God created for us, we can't have authentic relationships with other people either. And if you think about that, intuitively that makes sense. If I'm in a relationship with someone else and I'm pretending that I'm someone that I'm not, I give them a fake name and a fake occupation and fake hobbies. This happens with dating sites all the time. I can't have an authentic relationship with them because they have no idea who I really am. And when we reject the gift of our body, we're preventing ourselves from being able to enter into those authentic relationships. And so the two great commandments, love God and love others, we're unable to do when we follow gender ideology. So what does science say about all this? We've heard for years now, you got to follow the science, right? And we've heard for longer than that the Catholic Church hates science. There's an appendix in the book that I hope you read, because it talks about where the genesis of that notion came from and some of the terrible lies that have been told about the Catholic Church over the years, and its purported rejection of science when nothing can be further from the truth. All the science that we have supports the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage, on contraception, on abortion. But it really is one-sided when it comes to gender ideology. There is no scientific study anywhere, not one, that shows there's such a thing as a boy born in a girl's body or a girl born in a boy's body. It doesn't exist. In fact, our brains, even more than our body, are the most sexed organ in the body. Men and women differentiate emotion and pain how we see, how we hear, how we remember, how we navigate, all these things in sex-based ways. My wife and I laugh because we go out to dinner sometimes, and we have a great evening talking with each other. And in the car on the way home, I'll be talking about something we talked about, and she'll respond to that and then tell me about the conversations that took place at all the tables that were around us. and I have no ability to do that. But she can listen to all those other conversations without even trying and still be intimately paying attention to every word that I say. Men and women are different. There was a book, Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus. And we all used to laugh at that title because it was so true. And today that would be discrimination. So other things about science. This difference between men and women, it's found at every level of neuroscience and biology. And so any doctor with any self-respect would never say that someone's gender expression, their gender identity, determines their sex. So you might hear in the news that a trans woman, that's a boy who identifies as a girl, is a woman. As a matter of science, that's categorically false. Our sex, biology tells us, is determined by chromosomes and reproductive capacity. So one of the objections that you'll hear to this, well, what about intersex people? People who are born and they're not male or female. So at a minimum, maybe there's at least 3 sexes, or maybe that suggests that there's a spectrum of sexes, and so that gives gender ideology some credence. But that's not true. There is one type of kidney. If I'm born and I grow up and I have a kidney that doesn't develop correctly, it's a diseased kidney, no one would say I have a new kind of kidney. There aren't 2 kinds of kidney. There's only one kind of kidney. And so a development of sexual disorder is exactly that. It's a disordered development of a part of the human body. Doesn't mean that it's different than male or female sexes. It just means something that's disordered. And there's medications and other things that we can do to try to help those people. It's very difficult. Keep in mind that they're an extremely small percentage of the society, about 0.008. Which stands in stark contrast with the 10% plus of people young people who identify as transgender. But it doesn't suggest that there's a spectrum of sexes. There's still a male and a female sex. So what happens, what does science tell us happens, when someone tries to align their body with their mind rather than the other way around? And first, think about how absurd that is. It's not like gender dysphoria, this idea that you're trapped in the wrong body, is the only type of dysphoria that's out there. We've already mentioned one, anorexia. That's a disorder, a dysphoria, where someone in their mind thinks that their body is different than it actually is in reality. There are other things like body dysmorphia, where someone hates a part of their body and they want to remove it. All of those other dysphorias, the way that we treat them is to align the mind with the body. We would never tell someone who hates their arm and thinks it should be removed, yeah, here's a saw, cut it off. No doctor would remove it for them. We would never tell the anorexic, yes, you need to eat less so that your body matches your mind. It's only in gender dysphoria. And so as you would expect, when you pursue those treatments to change the body to reflect what the mind says, that things don't go very well. So take puberty blockers. That's kind of like the first step intervention for someone that is diagnosed as being transgender. A puberty blocker is given to someone pre-puberty to prevent them from fully developing their sexual organs. And we use something called puberty blockers to stop that with a very specific medical condition, precocious puberty. And that's when someone starts to go through puberty before they're supposed to. And there the drug is being used to try to help that person's natural and healthy development. Because at the end of the road, their body is still going to be allowed to develop, and they're going to be the adult that their body was created to be. But in the transgender science movement, they use these puberty blockers to stop someone from doing that permanently, so that the females don't grow breasts and that the males don't grow into their manly bodies. This is a way that it makes it easier then to have a surgery. Well, the best evidence that we have comes from Europe. Why is that? Well, in countries like the UK and Denmark and Sweden and Finland, they were on the forefront of this so-called gender care, far ahead of the United States. They were trying puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery long before we were. And they have an advantage because they have nationalized healthcare systems where you can follow a patient from birth until death. In the United States, if you give a kid puberty blockers at a Planned Parenthood clinic, they have no way to follow up to see how that kid is doing 6 months from now, a year from now, much less 20 years from now. And what those studies show, and the best one just came out recently from the UK, is that they have no discernible positive impact on mental health, but they can have devastating effects on mental health and physical health. It can not only temporarily pause, but permanently damage physical development, sexual development, and mental and emotional development in things that result in loss of bone density and future heart problems and other things like that. So then you move to the next stage, and those are cross-sex hormones, so giving estrogen to boys and testosterone for girls. If you do that with a girl, it would cause her to grow facial hair and things like that, to look more like a man. And the cross-sex hormones are worse than the puberty blockers. There's zero evidence that they do anything to help someone who actually has gender dysphoria feel better about themselves. But at the same time, it has all kinds of very dangerous medical consequences. And then you get to the surgeries. And again, the best long-term studies that we have show that the number of attempted and completed suicides, the number of mental health issues actually get worse over time. There may be a short-term effect where someone has a transgender surgery and they feel better about themselves for 6 months or a year or 2 years. But when you start looking at the 5-year and the 10-year results, it's an absolute disaster. So you put all these things together, you're causing problems with brains, bones, heart, of course sexual function and fertility. And you're also not treating what is often the root of the problem. So for example, when someone is diagnosed gender dysphoria, and this is a diagnosable mental health problem, psychologists will diagnose it, 60% of them have suffered some kind of sexual abuse. So think about that. If you're transitioning them, then none of them are getting the mental health help that they need to deal with the sexual abuse. Conversely, if you give kids the counseling that they need, in many cases, nearly all cases, they will naturally align their mind and body, and you won't be dealing with all these medical procedures. In fact, if you just leave kids alone and you don't do anything, 80 to 95% of those with gender dysphoria as kids will eventually just naturally align their mind and body. Now, what do you think happens with the kids who are encouraged to use preferred pronouns and to dress like the opposite sex and to use the opposite sex's shower to get on the puberty blocker and cross-sex hormones track? Nearly 100% of them will go on to continue having the gender dysphoria, and then will go on and have these other interventions which cause them great harm. So right at the very beginning, there's kind of this fork in the road. And you can either push kids towards health or you can push them towards harm. And so that gets into policy choices that you make right here at Sacred Heart in the school. Sometimes it seems sympathetic to use a child's preferred pronouns. You think, well, that's respectful. You wouldn't refuse to call someone the name that they use for themselves because that's hurtful, that's discrimination. You go further than that. Well, what does it hurt if they want to just dress as the opposite sex, or if they want to be in the bathroom but they've got their own stall and it's not invading anybody else's privacy? What you're doing is you're setting that child up for a lifetime of medical interventions that will bring them nothing but heartache, pain, and continued mental health problems. So you can't give in even at the outset. If you use the preferred pronouns, you're sending them down that path and you're not allowing them to end up where they need to be. And the best anecdotes that we have about what happens to people who go down the wrong path are from detransitioners. And these are individuals who have gone through a transition. They've done all the medicine and had their bodies changed and everything else. And then after a period of time realize they made a mistake. And so they detransition and now they present as their original sex. And at this point, their bodies are completely messed up. A woman who has her breasts removed when she's a teenager will never be able to breastfeed her child. Many of them don't get their sexual function or reproductive capacity back. On average, someone who's gone through one of these surgeries, even if they detransition, will have half the life expectancy of all the rest of us. And what you hear from these detransitioners over and over again is that no one told me that there were other options, that I could go into counseling instead of taking the cross-sex hormones and undergoing the surgery. No one told me that there were these long-term studies in Europe, because in the United States, you've got the American Medical Association and psychologists and pediatricians all pushing this stuff. And why do they do that? Well, it's the money. The fastest growing revenue stream at Planned Parenthood right now, prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. These transgender surgeries can cost $20,000 or more. And one of the big pushes is to make sure that your insurance will pay for it, your health insurance. So it's a total cash cow. So at the same time that these so-called gender care clinics are literally being shut down in England and Finland and Denmark and the UK, in America, they're exploding. We went from having only a couple of them 10 years ago to having hundreds of them today. We're doing exactly the wrong thing. And in the United States, when we try to have conversations about this, you're immediately shut down as a hater. Someone made a proposal, I forget if it was at the American Medical Association conference or the American Psychological Conference. Why don't we study this more to make sure that these are really valid treatments that are helping kids and not hurting them? And that was immediately shut down. They won't even consider the question. They censor and kick doctors and psychologists out of the club if they even try to raise it. But lately, publications that we don't think of as being very conservative, certainly not religious, are issuing articles about this that make clear the difference between where American medical practice is and where European practice is. There's an article on The Economist, there's an op-ed in the New York Times by a liberal columnist that condemn American doctors and American medical organizations for not following the science from these great long-term longitudinal carefully control group studies that are coming from Europe. It's an absolute crime. So the last topic I want to cover before just saying how do we respond to all this is just where this is coming from a cultural place. Because if you've got kids or grandkids, you have no idea what they're being exposed to right now. There's a cartoon show. It's called Blue's Clues. It's got a human actor who kind of plays the host, and then everything else in it is cartoons. People will put their 3- and 4-year-olds in front of the television while they go do a load of laundry or take a nap because this is a show that little kids can watch. Well, for Pride Month, a couple of years ago, they had a Pride parade, and it was 10 floats, and they were singing it to the tune of The Ants Come Marching One by One, and it was being sung by a very famous drag performer, and each one of the floats was promoting one aspect of the LGBT agenda. One of those floats had a child beaver with tape across her chest where her breasts had been removed. And when people saw that, they couldn't believe it. And so they asked the producers of the show, was that a transgender beaver that had her breasts removed? And they confirmed that was yes, that was intentional. And 3- and 4-year-olds are getting that. In social media, there are millions and millions of posts on Instagram and YouTube and other places encouraging kids to explore these trans identities. And if there's a kid who's experiencing difficulty at school because they're not forming relationships and they're kind of depressed, this is sold as the quick fix. And as soon as they come out as transgender, they're celebrated by their peers. They have new friends online. This gives them everything that they were looking for. And then they go down this road that harms them. Those cell phones, the worst possible thing that a kid could have in front of them because they get immediate access to all this stuff and to predators who are going to encourage kids to identify as transgender without the parents even having any idea that it's happening. Then we've got laws. Right here in Michigan, if you are a counselor and you want to help a young person identify as trans through counseling, you're free to do that, encouraged. But if the child wants to align their mind with their body to get over their gender dysphoria, with the parent's consent, and you give them that counseling, you can lose your counseling license. And that's true in 20 other states and 100 local jurisdictions. That means if there was a detransitioner and they wanted to go to counseling after they were detransitioning and trying to get their body back, they couldn't even get it in 20 states and 100 local jurisdictions. You've got laws like the Michigan Elliott Larson expansion that we're fighting in the Sacred Heart lawsuit. You've got it with sports laws in various jurisdictions where they require schools to allow boys who identify as girls to participate on the girls' teams and take trophies and places in races away from the girls. It's absolutely pervasive. And so you might think, well, I don't have anybody in my family who's identified as transgender. I don't have any close friends whose families have experienced this. This isn't something that I need to worry about. It's going to happen. It's everywhere in our culture. It's absolutely unavoidable. And there's all kinds of litigation about this. I have 2 cert petitions pending at the Supreme Court right now, one for West Virginia, one for Idaho, involving their Save Women's Sports laws, which require schools to not allow boys to participate on the sports teams. There's another case up there. It's called Skirmetti. I argued a similar case in the Ninth Circuit just a month or 2 ago. And it involves the 20 states that have prohibited puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries for the purpose of transitioning minors. And the ACLU and the federal government say that violates equal protection rights under the federal Constitution. And so they're going to be hearing that this term. There are all kinds of cases pending in the courts involving transition of kids at school without parents' knowledge or intentionally hiding it from them, as was the case in Rockford. You've got employers who are being sued because they didn't hire someone who identified as transgender because that violated the employer's religious beliefs. You've even got parents who want to be foster parents or adoptive parents being excluded from the system because they won't affirm that they're going to give their adoptive child these puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery if they identify as transgender. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's going to affect you. So how do we respond? Briefly, so we can get to questions. First, you need to get more educated about the topic so that you can have conversations with your family members and your friends and your coworkers about all this. We have only covered this at the most surface level. I encourage you to read the book. There are other good resources out there listed in the back of the book. Read all the church documents that are referenced in the book because we need to be able to talk about this. Second, if you've got someone in your family who is expressing gender dysphoria, ask a lot of questions and accompany them. It's like Pope Francis says, we've got to be a field hospital, and that takes hard work. The shepherds have to smell like the sheep, and sometimes parents and friends have to do the same. Just like anorexia or any other dysphoria, it's not like gender dysphoria pops up one day and then goes away the next, although there are social contagions like that, which we don't even have time to get into, but it's a long process. Third, you've got to resist policies that promote the lie. Resist preferred pronouns. Resist the showers and the locker room use by the opposite sex. Resist the boys participating on the girls' teams. You've got to resist all of that. And sometimes that can be a risky thing to do. When Sacred Heart files a lawsuit in federal court, it puts a target on its back for the Attorney General and the ACLU and Lambda Legal and everybody else to try to punish them in the future. People lose their jobs over this if they won't conform at work. But there are all kinds of religious accommodations and other protections that will protect you along the way if you run into that situation. Fourth, make sure that your church is on board with the church's teachings on gender ideology. That's not a problem here at Sacred Heart, but if you go to another church, it might be. But Pope Francis has spoken unequivocally about this. Many bishops in the United States have spoken about this. I've heard Bishop Okowiak talk about it. We need to make sure that we're strong at the pulpit as well as strong at home. And then finally, the whole respect and dignity portion of this. The instinct of the Vatican when they were talking about gender ideology in the Catholic schools was that we don't want bullying and we don't want unjust discrimination. And that's absolutely true. Our brothers and sisters who are experiencing gender dysphoria are going through a very difficult problem. That's not unique. We have brothers and sisters who have same-sex attractions, who are alcoholics, who are addicted to pornography, all kinds of other things. And we need to love them and respect them, not demean them in any way, even if the subject seems difficult or icky to us. But we need to love them in the way that the church has called us to love. And when we do that, we're going to be able to not only help that individual, but create a culture that values the church's teachings on the human body and human sexuality. And that will result in the kind of flourishing that will turn back the clock on all these evils that we have seen as a result of the sexual revolution. So with that, why don't I pause, and I'm happy to take your questions.